Growing up with my mom felt like navigating a world of chaos. She was consumed by her addiction, and I often felt like an afterthought. Most days, I fended for myself, finding ways to stay out of her way or entertain myself while she disappeared into her habits. At 6 or 7 years old, I didn't fully understand why my life was different from other kids, but I knew enough to realize that the world wasn't as safe as it seemed on TV. One night stands out clearer than the rest, burned into my memory. My mom had taken me with her to a neighborhood I instinctively knew wasn't good. The streets were dimly lit, and the houses looked tired, their windows dark and lifeless. She parked her beat-up car near a house that looked like it might fall apart if the wind blew too hard. "Stay here," she muttered before leaving me in the back seat, closing the door with a slam. I remember curling up against the seat, my jacket barely keeping me warm as the night grew colder. I tried to keep myself distracted, but the long minutes dragged on, and the uneasy silence outside the car began to press in. I wasn't afraid. Not yet. This wasn't the first time she'd left me alone in unfamiliar places. But something about that night felt different, though I couldn't say why. I don't know how long I waited before it happened. The sound of heavy footsteps pulled my attention to the window. A man with a scruffy beard and dark, wild eyes appeared out of nowhere. His face was hard to see in the dim light, but his presence radiated menace. Before I could react, he yanked the car door open and grabbed me by the arm. "Don't scream," he growled, his voice low and rough as he dragged me out of the car. My small legs stumbled to keep up as he pulled me along the empty street. I was too scared to cry out. My voice caught in my throat as fear overwhelmed me. I kept thinking my mom would appear, that this would all stop, but she didn't come, and I didn't know where we were going. We walked for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, weaving through alleys and shadowy streets until we reached a rundown building in the projects. The windows were broken, the door barely hanging on its hinges. He shoved me inside, muttering to himself, though I couldn't make out the words. My mind raced, trying to understand what he wanted, why he'd taken me. I felt trapped, frozen, unsure if I should fight or stay still. My heart pounded as I glanced around the dark room, praying for a way out. And then, as if summoned by sheer desperation, a new figure appeared in the doorway, a man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, his expression sharp and unyielding. The man in the doorway didn't hesitate. His eyes flicked from me to the scruffy bearded man, narrowing instantly. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with something cold and dangerous. The bearded man barked something in response, his grip tightening on my arm, but the cigarette man wasn't interested in a conversation. He stepped forward with startling speed, throwing a punch that sent the bearded man stumbling. I fell to the ground, scrambling away as they fought. The cigarette man was relentless, landing blow after blow until my captor crumpled to the floor. Even then, he wasn't done. He dragged the unconscious man to the staircase and shoved him down with a force that made the entire building shake. The cigarette man turned to me, his chest heaving as he exhaled smoke. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice rough but steady. My instinct told me to trust him, even though he looked just as rough around the edges as the man who had taken me. He picked me up easily, cradling me in his arms like I weighed nothing. "Stay quiet," he said as we left the building. The streets felt endless as he carried me, slipping between alleys and shadows. We paused whenever a patrol car passed, his movements cautious and deliberate. I didn't know why he avoided the police, but I didn't care. He was taking me back, and that was all that mattered. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the street where my mom's car was still parked. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the area, and I saw her standing with a group of police officers, her hands gesturing wildly as she spoke. My heart leapt at the sight of her, but it was quickly followed by a pang of anger. She had left me, and now everything felt like a blur of chaos. The cigarette man crouched down, setting me on my feet. "Go," he said, pointing toward the car. "Run to them." His tone left no room for argument, but when I turned to thank him, he was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows before I could say a word. I ran to my mom, the adrenaline and fear finally spilling out as I clung to her. She hugged me tightly, but her words to the officers didn't match the truth. She wandered off, she said, her voice shaking. I only left her for a minute. I wanted to correct her, to tell the officers about the bearded man and the cigarette man, but my fear kept me silent. The look in her eyes told me to stay quiet, and I obeyed. It wasn't until days later, when I was safely with my dad, that I told someone the full truth. I described the man who had taken me and the man who had saved me. My dad listened carefully, his face tight with anger and concern. Soon after, he gained custody of me, ensuring I wouldn't have to stay with my mom anymore. Life became steadier, safer, but the events of that night never left me. Even now, I think about the cigarette man. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. His rough edges and evasive movements suggested he had his own reasons for avoiding the police. But in that moment, he chose to help me, to step in when no one else did. I don't know who he was or what his life was like, but I owe him everything. Wherever he is, I hope he knows how much his actions meant. Some people change your life in an instant, and he was one of them. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind where the world feels slow and comfortable. My brother interrupted the peace with a simple request, a run to the corner store to grab drinks. I hesitated at first, not particularly keen on venturing out into the cool night, but he pressed, and I relented. It wasn't a big deal, just a short walk to the store and back. I grabbed my wallet, slipped on my jacket, and stepped outside. The streets were unusually empty, the kind of quiet that made every sound stand out. My footsteps echoed softly against the pavement as I made my way to the store. The air carried a slight chill, but I barely noticed. Inside the store, I quickly found what I needed, paid, and walked out with the bottles tucked into both hands. It felt good to be heading back, the familiar route reassuring in its simplicity. The walk home started as uneventfully as the walk there, but a faint prickling sensation began to creep up my spine. At first, I ignored it, focusing on the rhythmic sound of my footsteps. But something didn't feel right. The once comforting emptiness of the street now felt exposed, vulnerable. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. Ahead of me, a man in a maroon pullover walked at a measured pace, his head tilted slightly as if he was listening for something. Behind me, another figure appeared, wearing a gray hoodie. I glanced back, trying not to be obvious, and noticed his pace matched mine, neither speeding up nor slowing down. My grip tightened on the bottles in my hands as I tried to shake the unease. The two men didn't seem connected at first, just separate people on the same street. But as I kept walking, their movements began to feel intentional. The man in the hoodie adjusted his pace, closing the gap between us, while the one in the maroon pullover subtly angled his path to align with mine. I quickened my steps, heart pounding as I tried to put more distance between us. The air felt heavier, the silence now oppressive. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. My house wasn't far, but the growing tension made the distance feel insurmountable. I glanced around for anyone else, any sign of help, but the street was eerily empty. It was just me, the two men, and the shadows that seemed to grow darker with each passing second. As I approached an alleyway, I noticed a faint hum of an engine in the distance. I glanced up just in time to see a black Subaru pull out from a side street. The car's headlights sliced through the shadows, and it moved with a deliberate slowness that immediately made me uneasy. I kept walking, gripping the bottles tightly, pretending not to notice. The car sped up slightly, pulling alongside me, then stopped abruptly. It blocked my path, pinning me against the alley's brick wall. My heart raced as the driver's door creaked open. A man stepped out, his silhouette outlined by the dim streetlights. His movements were deliberate, his presence oppressive. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his stance screamed danger. Panic surged through me. My instincts screamed at me to move, to do something, anything. Without a second thought, I bolted, adrenaline fueling my legs as I sprinted away from the car. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy and purposeful. I didn't dare look back. The bottles in my hands felt like anchors, but I held on to them, clutching them tightly as I ran. The footsteps behind me grew louder, echoing off the walls of the narrow street. My breath came in short, desperate bursts as I darted down the road, my mind racing as fast as my legs. I zigzagged, hoping to make it harder for them to catch me, the though I didn't know if the men were still on foot or if the car was following. I turned a corner and risked a glance back. The two men were there, running after me, their figures dark and menacing in the dim light. My house wasn't far now. If I could just keep running, just stay ahead, I might make it. As I neared my street, the sounds of pursuit began to fade. Either they were giving up, or I had somehow managed to outpace them. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I reached my front door, fumbling with the key before finally shoving it into the lock and tumbling inside. Once inside, I bolted the door and pressed my back against it, trying to catch my breath. The house was silent, my brother oblivious to the chaos I'd just escaped. My hands trembled as I set the bottles on the counter, the realization of how close I had come sinking in. I peeked through the blinds, scanning the street for any sign of the black Subaru or the two men. The street was empty now, quiet and still. That night, I double-checked every lock in the house, leaving the lights on as I tried to sleep. Though I was safe, the memory stayed vivid, a constant reminder of how quickly an ordinary night could spiral into danger. It changed the way I viewed the world, making me more cautious, more alert. Some lessons you don't forget, and that night taught me one thing above all: trust your instincts, because they might just save your life. 2 years ago, during my second year at university in France, I was making my way back to my student flat after a long day. The walk from the bus stop to my building was familiar, a short stretch of quiet streets and dim streetlights that usually felt unremarkable. But that night was different. I was tired, my body weighed down by the effects of morphine I relied on for chronic pain. The medication dulled the sharp edges of my discomfort, but left me foggy and slower than usual, a vulnerability I was all too aware of. The streets were unusually empty, the silence heavy as I moved carefully along the path. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed an old white car parked along the curb. The man in the driver's seat seemed to be watching me, though I tried to dismiss the thought. It was late, maybe he was just waiting for someone. Still, a prickle of unease settled in the back of my mind, and I quickened my pace. As I walked past the car, it started up and pulled away from the curb. My stomach tightened when I realized it wasn't driving off. It was following me. The soft hum of the engine grew louder as the car slowed to match my pace, its headlights casting long, eerie shadows ahead of me. I glanced back briefly, just enough to notice movement inside. There were more people in the car. My pulse quickened as I forced myself to keep walking, each step feeling heavier than the last. The car stayed with me, its tires rolling slowly along the pavement as if to avoid drawing attention. My building was just ahead, its faint lights a beacon of safety in the dark. I tried to focus on it, willing myself not to look back again, though I could feel their presence like a shadow looming behind me. My disorientation from the morphine blurred my thoughts, making it hard to plan or think clearly. As I reached the entrance to my building, the car screeched to a halt. The doors flung open, and the sound of hurried footsteps filled the air. I didn't need to look to know they were chasing me. Adrenaline surged through my body as I fumbled with the keys in my hand, the tremble in my fingers making it nearly impossible to unlock the door. Every second felt like an eternity, the footsteps growing louder and closer. Finally, the key turned, and I shoved the door open, slipping inside just as the first man reached it. The heavy door slammed shut, and they crashed into it with a loud thud. My heart raced as I locked the door and backed away, watching through the small window as they pounded on the glass, shouting something I couldn't understand but didn't need to. Their aggression was enough. I didn't wait to see if they would leave. I bolted up the stairs, not stopping until I reached my flat, locking myself inside and collapsing onto the floor. My body shook with fear as I tried to catch my breath, my mind spinning with what could have happened if I had been a second slower. My hands trembled as I sat on the floor of my flat, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. I half expected to hear the men breaking into the building, their shouts growing louder, but the only noise was the faint hum of my refrigerator. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the strength to stand and peek out the window. The street below was empty, the old white car nowhere in sight. But the absence of the car didn't bring me comfort. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if they were still lurking just out of view. I couldn't stay there alone, not after what had just happened. Grabbing my keys and phone, I left my flat and made my way to my sister's apartment a few blocks away. The short walk felt like miles, every shadow a potential threat. When I arrived, I knocked frantically, and the relief I felt when she opened the door nearly brought me to tears. I spent the night on her couch, but sleep didn't come easily. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving behind a deep, lingering dread. Weeks passed, and though I hadn't seen the white car again, the fear it had instilled remained. I avoided walking alone at night, even if it meant rearranging my schedule or relying on others for help. My sister and I talked about the incident often, trying to make sense of it, but the lack of answers only deepened our unease. Then one evening, it happened again. My sister was on her way home from work when she saw the same white car creeping along the road. The sight of it was unmistakable, its worn exterior and slow pace triggering a wave of panic. She didn't wait to see who was inside. She ran as fast as she could, darting through side streets and alleys until she reached her building. She told me about it later that night, her voice shaking as she recounted the familiar feeling of being watched, hunted. We knew this wasn't an isolated incident. Together, we warned our neighbors, sharing what we had experienced in the hopes of keeping others safe. Some listened with concern, others dismissed it, but the tension in our community grew as similar stories began to surface. The white car became a specter, its presence whispered about but never caught. The final step was reporting it to the police. We recounted everything: my initial encounter, my sister's sighting, and the stories we'd heard from others. The officers listened carefully, their expressions grim as they shared what little they knew. The car matched the description of vehicles involved in other abduction attempts, but there was no solid evidence to act on. The men in the car remained shadows, their identities unknown, and their motives unclear.